Now, most people think archives are dusty, complicated, difficult documents which require professional training as a historian to understand, and some of them are. But most archives tell stories about people just like us who leave traces behind them in records, either deliberately or unintentionally. The Census of 1911 is a prime example of an archival resource full of personal stories left to us to explore 100 years later and with meaning far beyond the intentions underlying its original creation. Censuses are as old as organized human society. Most of us born Christian will remember the Bible story of Herod's census of Palestine, which had interesting consequences. Knowing how many people you rule, or can get taxes from, or persecute, or plan schools, transport, and hospitals for, or conscript into an army is essential to any government, whether benign or malevolent, for the running of its affairs. Ireland began to have proper countrywide censuses in 1821, and they took place at 10-yearly intervals thereafter. Due to cultural vandalism and bureaucratic stupidity, two curses of which we are still not free, we lost all of them from 1821 to 1891. So the first full surviving census records for Ireland are those for 1901 and 1911. We, in the National Archives where I work, decided to digitize them some years ago when there was money to be got for such projects. No longer is that the case, I'm afraid. The website, and that's the homepage of the website for those of you who don't know it, www.census.nationalarchives.ie, has been incredibly popular, reaching 15 million unique visitors and receiving 750 million hits so far. Almost everyone is interested in their ancestors, some for reasons of self-aggrandizement. Look how posh my family is. Some to answer difficult questions. What became of my grandfather's first wife? But most from natural curiosity. Who were they? Am I like them? What connections exist between us? The Irish Census website is free to access, something we in the National Archives feel very passionately should be the case. In Ireland, as I've indicated, we've destroyed a great deal of our cultural heritage, some through war and revolution, some through colonial attrition, and some through willful ignorance. And that applies not just to our archival heritage, but other parts of it too. The least we can do now is to use the wonderful tool, which is the internet, to make what remains freely available to our own citizens and to our extensive 70 million strong diaspora, many of whom were forced to leave the country due to economic recession at best and catastrophic famine at worst. Because the site is free, you can look up your own ancestors, but also everybody else's. You can gratify your vulgar curiosity as to what the neighbours were up to, something we all like to know even now. You can look at whole streets and townlands and get a vivid picture of what they were like back then. You can find people staying with relatives and try to work out why. Holiday, fosterage, education, employment, kidnapping. You can search for particular occupations, nationalities, and religions in particular places. How many Methodist butchers were there in Cork? How many French governesses were there in Dublin? How many Plymouth Brethren in Rathmines? And the answer, by the way, to that question is there were 18 Plymouth Brethren in Rathmines. Hours of harmless and instructive fun to be had, and you can try this at home. However, one of the most interesting side effects of the census going online has been a new attitude to ancestral poverty. The truth is that most Irish people come from fairly humble backgrounds originally. City dwellers from tenements and artisan dwellings, rural dwellers from labourers' cottages. While the Land Act sorted out ownership issues for most rural families by transferring ownership from landlord to tenant in a relatively short time at the beginning of the 20th century, urban dwellers had no such recourse. And I often wonder if Michael Davitt would not spin in his grave to see the conditions under which people who rent in Dublin still have to live. In 1911, Dublin had one of the worst slums in Europe. 26,000 families lived in tenement houses, 20,000 of those families in single rooms. Mortality rates were 22.3 per thousand. In London, they were just 15.6. TB, diphtheria, gastroenteritis, scarlet fever, cholera, and typhoid were all killers. Child mortality was extremely high. Life was a real struggle for people in these conditions. Many were out of work, and the pawn shop and the pub were frequent haunts to raise money and then to spend it. Women had to bear the brunt of running households in drafty, high-ceilinged, albeit sometimes beautiful rooms, where water for washing and cooking had to be carried daily, often up several flights of stairs, and where a single tap at the back of the house might be the only source of water. Sean O'Casey's three great plays give the flavour of how life was lived in the deteriorated habitations of the aristocracy who had fled to London and elsewhere after the Act of Union. Many people were ashamed of having come from the tenements. Upward social mobility, emigration, interclass marriage, and Ireland's highly dysfunctional relationship with poverty all had an effect on how people saw their pasts, and mostly the effect was to encourage amnesia. With the release of the census online, possibly in some part to do with our little moment of increased, if very false, prosperity, curiosity overcame shame, and the descendants of tenement dwellers went in search of their forebears. One of my colleagues told me he cried when he found his great-grandmother in a house in Henrietta Street with many children. He had never been able to find her before because he didn't know where she lived. Working-class people moved all over the city all the time back then, usually to avoid paying arrears of rent. And crossing the river, then as now, was a serious cultural statement. This experience was repeated countless times. Many people would talk to me after public events on the census and tell me the stories of their families who lived in pretty awful conditions, but who had survived and had reared their children. Pride and survival skills began to replace shame due to poverty. The heroic qualities of people who lived through some of the most turbulent years in Irish history began to be apparent. The determination to build a mass trade union movement, much of it spearheaded by tenement dwellers, by carters, dockers and labourers, and later by women employed in confectionery and textiles, began to be seen for what it was, an organised attempt by intelligent, desperate people, fired by a passionate sense of injustice to improve life for themselves, their families and their communities. I know the trade union movement is out of odour in Ireland at the moment, and in some cases for good reason. But next year, in 2013, we're going to be commemorating the 1913 lockout, and that's a very significant moment, not just in Dublin history, but in Irish history in terms of the creation of one of the great civic society organisations, which still has a great deal to give us, I believe. We'll take a quick look through the census at what people found when they went looking. Now, you're going to have to look at a few archival records, forgive me. There are 3 statistical forms that come with every street or townland in the 1911 census. The first one tells you how many people lived on the street or in the townland and what religious persuasion they were of. So we can see here for Buckingham Street, which is a street off Amiens Street in the north inner city, it's still there today. There were 16 inhabited houses, and if we look at the very bottom of the page here, a few columns in, we see that in those 16 houses there were 499 people living in 1911. We see that it's overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, with just 27 members of the Church of Ireland. Dublin was quite a homogeneous city religiously in 1911, but you can see a very Catholic bias on this street here. On the next form, this is a very interesting form, and again, remember you can do all this at home for nothing, and do it fast before the people who want to charge money start making us pay for it. This is what tells you what kind of building was on every street, how many rooms were in each building, and how many people lived in each room. Okay, so it's a very micro level analysis of how people were living at the time. So number 13, for that is the house we're going to be focusing on. We can see that it's a first-class house. You add up a whole lot of stuff about the walls, the roof, the number of rooms in the house, the number of windows in the front of the house, and you get a classification first, second, third, or fourth class. This is a first-class house because, of course, it would have been a grand house when built at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Now it is a tenement, and we know when we look at it that there are 49 people living in this house in 9 rooms, okay? And that ranges from 10 people in 2 rooms, the only well-off family, if you like, in the whole household, to 9 people living in 1 room. So again, think of the implications of that kind of overcrowding and of families trying to endure what goes on there. We're just looking at that. Let me catch up with myself. Yes, we are moving on now to one of the families. And this is what you can do with the census, is move your way down hierarchically from the level of the street or the townland into the actual household. This is one of the households of those 49 people in number 13 Buckingham Street at this point. George and Marjorie Dixon. George is 53. He's a bricklayer. He's married to Marjorie, who's 48. They're living with 5 of their children, and at the very bottom there, Thomas Power, a nurse child. So they have a foster child living with them. Again, a debate that's going on at the moment about how all of that works. Could have been a relative, although they don't say so. Definitely not a wet nurse situation, because Marjorie at 48 is too old to be breastfeeding, but possibly there for payment, possibly not. We don't know, and often the census raises more questions than it answers. But the really terrible piece of information on this form is the child mortality levels. In this column over here, fourth from the right, it tells you that George and Marjorie were married for 28 years, that Marjorie gave birth to 13 children, and that 6 of those children survived. So she lost 7 children. Now, it's very hard for us to imagine the attrition that leads to. A household like that challenges all kinds of assumptions we have today about privacy, about sexuality, about affection between parents and children. How do people overcome those kinds of traumatic experiences and move on? Our next look is at a further household there, and this is even sadder. These are the McNamaras, and we have here allegedly 12 people living in a single room, but in fact it's only 10, because Lucy McNamara, who's 30 years old, who's been married for 15 years, she married at the age of 15, gave birth to 9 children, 7 survived, and she put in the names of the 2 dead children, Bernard, who was 5 years old when he died, and Josephine, who was 7 months old. The policeman who came around to collect the census returns scratched out their names and wrote "error dead" at the side of the column there, which is just utterly tragic when you look at it. It gives you some idea of her anguish. She was trying to commemorate her children in some way, to put their names down on an official document. And at least we do know their actual names now, which is really important. Now, that excursion into Buckingham Street gives you some idea of what life might have been like. Quick 2 photographs. This is Tyrone Street in the background here, the modern Sean McDermott Street. These houses are now long gone. They were tenement houses. You can see the gaunt backs of the tenements there, and a bunch of people here, some of them barefoot, looking at us. Remarkable photographs taken in 1913 as a result of an inquiry into the housing of the working classes. Some of these children, as I say, barefoot, and most of them, this would have probably been the only photograph ever taken of them. Another photograph of a single-room tenement dwelling in Francis Street. 2 children there, one at the door, one in the bed with her doll. And again, very unusual to have photographs of poor housing interiors at this point in time. It came because of that commission of inquiry that we're talking about. Now, everyone started to think about the tenements when they were able to look at the census and to talk about it a little more than they had. And this is what encouraged TV3 to show this program called The Tenements, which they showed in the summer of last year, which is traditionally a very poor viewing time at 9:30 in the evening, 4 programs. Record viewing figures, 280,000 people every night for the 4 weeks. So TV3 are reeling from the effects of historical programs on the television and intend, I hope, to do more. And again, that was inspired by the 1911 census. At the time the program went out, I was having my roof repaired. And I came down the morning after the first program. I had been on the program talking about the census, and the 3 lads who were doing the roof, who were all Dobbs, said, "Hey, you were on the telly last night talking about the tenements." And I said, "Yeah." "We grew up in tenements." And I said, "Yeah, but we never talk about it." And I said, "Okay, talk about it now." So there and then we had a workshop in my street with these 3 guys about growing up in the tenements, and they discovered that they were experts on a subject that was now of great interest to a lot of other people. And they weren't ashamed, they were suddenly proud. And that was a lovely, lovely moment to observe. And one hopes that that instinct will extend to others, that looking back at the poverty that people endured, many of our ancestors endured at the turn of the last century or close into it, will make people more compassionate about poverty then, and by extension, poverty now. And just to make you laugh, because archives can also make you laugh, here's another tenement entry. These are the Cullens in Blessington Street. Robert Cullen, his wife Catherine, and their many children, many industrious children. Robert is a porter. One of his daughters is a seamstress. One is a typist. One is a junior clerk. And there's a son who's an apprentice to bookbinding. So they're all getting on. They're living in 3 rooms in a tenement house in Blessington Street. But at the bottom of the page, we have another member of the household, Tatters Cullen, whose relationship to the head of the household is dog. And we learn from the return that he cannot read, that he's 3 years old, and that he was born in County Longford. They don't tell us whether he's married or single. So just to remember that archives can also make you laugh. Tatters was the name of the dog in the Shockroan, which was Boucicault's great melodrama that was famous at the time. So thank you for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the evening.